Please do welcome Andrew.
Thank you very much. That's very kind, and I really am delighted to be here with you, even though we're going to be talking about a difficult subject. So, just to get it clear, I am going to be talking tonight about abuse that happens within the church, and I need to say right at the beginning that for some people that is a personal and very difficult experience. So if it is something that comes close to you, feel free to do whatever you need to look after yourself. If you're watching online, you might need to switch off. That's fine. If you're here in person and you need to take a break, or you want to talk to somebody afterwards, then please do that. What I'm saying is, please look after yourself. Take care of yourself in this, if this comes close to you. I'm not going to talk about kind of the details of abuse. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into this strange place, but then to try and reflect on how the church engages with people who have been caught up in its life. Somebody said to me the other day, I walked along with the church until I found that I had my hair caught in the wheels. And I thought, what a terrible picture that is, but I could imagine that. So if you've had your hair caught in the wheels of the church, I hope some of these reflections will ring bells for you. I've written a book most recently, this one, called Bleeding for Jesus, that tells the story of one particular appalling case of abuse within the church, an abuser called John Smyth, who was a barrister who abused a lot of young men in England in the 1970s and 80s, and then was sent by the church to Zimbabwe, where he carried on abusing until he died in 2017. And it was through discovering the story of John Smyth as part of my journalistic work and uncovering that I accidentally got involved in this wider work of those who've been hurt in the life of the church. So you're very welcome to read that story. It's quite a grim read. I was just saying there's only one joke in it. If you want something a bit more cheerful, this book here, Faith, Hope and Mischief, is a book of stories, and there's lots more fun to be had in that, and it's a good Christmas present. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. It's also interesting that today happens to be the day when, after 7 years of work, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse has published its report at midday today. We could talk about that in the room if you would be interested in that. I have had an opportunity to have a little look at it, but it's not primarily what I'm talking about. I come at this as a Christian theologian and a writer who long ago rejected an invitation to be ordained in the Church of England because I feared that it would make it more difficult for me to exercise my priestly vocation if I were ordained, and that turned out to be correct. For the past several years, I've walked with victims of church abuse as a friend and as an advocate, and the most important qualification I find in that work is that I'm not ordained, because I walk with a lot of people who couldn't possibly engage with somebody who was. So this time, this evening, is going to draw quite heavily on what I've learnt from those victims of church-based abuse, and also from my experience of engaging with the church alongside them. My intention is not to diagnose what's at fault in the church's systems and practices. We could talk about that for ages, and the church does, but talks about it as if some kind of tinkering and rearrangement of the machinery might put things right. But I want to take a step back from that and offer a contribution towards thinking theologically about abuse first and what it means, and repair and redress. Painful as it is, we need to think deeply about what abuse is and what place it has in the life of the church, as well as thinking carefully about the nature of healing and repair. I make no assumptions about where anybody is coming from in terms of kind of faith or religion. I'm easy about that. but I am going to talk a little bit about one key Bible text, and the title of the talk, Falling Among Thieves, some will recognise as coming from that Bible text. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. It's such a familiar story. It's one of those that we could probably half tell almost without thinking about it. And that's a problem with Bible texts. So I'm going to read it to us, but in order to give us a fresh way of looking at it, I'm going to read it straight from the Gospel of Luke, but with one minor change. And that is, I'm going to make the victim a woman, not a man. Only as an experiment, really, to see whether it rings different bells for us. So this is briefly the story that Jesus told in Luke chapter 10. A woman was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when she was attacked by robbers. They stripped her of her clothes, beat her, and went away, leaving her half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the woman, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw her, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the woman was, and when he saw her, he took pity on her. He went to her and bandaged her wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the woman on his own donkey, brought her to an inn, and took care of her. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after her," he said, "and when I return I'll reimburse you for any extra expense you might have." Now, which of these 3, Jesus said, do you think was a neighbour to the woman who fell among thieves? What is abuse? Too often we construct abuse as an event or a procession of events in which the emphasis is on the actions of an abuser rather than on the impact on the victim. The Church of England recently published its second past cases review, and although it had invested millions of pounds and years of work into it, made exactly the same mistake. All it did was look at its own personnel files to see if it could identify people who were abusers. Of course, it's true that every case of abuse involves an individual or an organisation using their power to inflict damage on another person, a disempowered other person. So in legal terms, abuse is dealt with according to how appropriate or inappropriate the action of the abuser was in the context of their relationship with the victim. And the Church has adopted exactly that civil approach. Christian theology constructs abuse quite differently. The offence is not primarily located in the act itself, nor in the physical or emotional or spiritual damage that's done to the victim, but in the violation of the relationship between one God-graced person and another, and the disruptive effect of that relationship on the wider community. The harm is done to both the victim and the abuser and the community. Almost inevitably, the abuser is abusing their power to satisfy some sort of spiritual or psychological deficiency, such as fear or narcissism or repressed sexuality, as in the case of the Bleeding for Jesus story. It comes from a need to control. The way that the parable of the Good Samaritan is cast offers an example of that. The focus of Jesus' story is not on the fact that a person has been beaten up and stripped by robbers. He doesn't go into any detail about that. The violence of that attack is almost glossed over. It's treated as kind of almost an inevitable fact of life. Just the sort of thing that happens on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho that will be familiar to lots of women and some men here. But the focus of the story is on the relationships between the wounded victim and the passers-by, representatives of wider society, representatives especially of religious communities. The real earth tremor in the story occurs when we see the inhumanity with which the priest and the Levite treat the victim. In the first assault by the thieves, the person is robbed of their property, their clothing, their dignity, and beaten up. In the second assault by the priest and the Levite, they're robbed of their identity, their self-worth, their hope for recovery. And then that's contrasted with the grace that you see in the relationship between the victim and the Samaritan. The Samaritan isn't even described as good. We shouldn't call this the story of the Good Samaritan. This is simply, according to Jesus, how two people who meet on the road should treat each other. Not with the violence of the robbers, not with the superiority of the priest or the disdain of the Levite, but with the grace from one to another of the Samaritan and the victim who give and receive care. I reckon that before the church's PR people got their hands on this story wasn't called the story of the Good Samaritan. It was called the story of the bad priest. The distinctive of Christian theology is that wounded relationships matter as much, if not more, than wounded bodies. The priest and the Levite didn't simply ignore the needs of the victim. Their story makes a point of the fact that they see the victim, but make a choice to define themselves against that victim. They don't just walk past, they cross the road. Every time an archbishop or a bishop, and it's happened again today in response to the ICSA report, every time a bishop or an archbishop says that they're aware of victims, they're shamed by what's happened and so on, and yet doesn't act, doesn't do anything to make that relationship better, they make it worse. And that's a huge problem in the church. The priest and the Levite never acknowledge their own wounds and their conflicted feelings at seeing a naked, bleeding man or woman at the side of the road. John Smyth, Bishop Peter Ball, Bishop Victor Whitsey, all the others, they were victims too, not necessarily in the conventional sense. Archbishop Justin Welby, Archbishop Stephen Cottrell, and all the others, they are victims too, as their relationships with ordinary broken people in the world are distorted by the roles they have to take on in the church. It's a huge problem, and it starts with questions of deference towards leaders, all sorts of leaders. But back to the nature of abuse, there are three dimensions to this kind of disjuncture in relationship. The most obvious is the harm done to the personhood of the victim. And the second is the idolatry of the abuser, who takes on a kind of superhuman, godlike, more important than you status within the relationship. And then the third dimension is the wounds inflicted on the community. By leaving that victim unattended, the priest and the Levite don't only harden their own hearts, they also make the road from Jerusalem to Jericho that bit more dangerous for future travellers. They're hurrying off to join their faith communities, waiting for them to arrive. And not surprisingly, when they get there, they don't mention the shocking encounter they just had with a naked victim on the side of the road. It just gets absorbed within them. The impact of the wounding and their response to it becomes a secret between the priest and the victim. The nature of abuse is to strip the victim of their personhood. It's an attack on the self. The victim's objectified as a possession to be manipulated into the form of the abuser. Abuse is a deliberate attempt to overwrite the personhood of one individual with the identity of another, to say, me, my organisation, my way of thinking and doing things is more important than you and what you bring to this. You are not wholly yourself. You're mine. It's profoundly intimate, deeply invasive, the most fundamental form of identity theft. And yet it occurs between two wounded people, both capable of good and evil. Abuse occurs when a broken person misuses their potency to harm another broken person. And the broken victim who cries out for justice is a theologian and a prophet whose voice the church really needs to hear. When a wounded victim, robbed of all but the last scrap of their dignity and their integrity, cries out, I am human too, and broken as I am, I matter as well, she's bringing to the church a profound lived truth. And that's a truth that people who feel the need to project strength desperately need to understand. A weak church with weak leaders desperately needs to hear the voices of people who have been made weak and still know grace. And when the victim stubbornly says to the church, as many of my friends do, stubbornly says to the church, you're better than this, the church needs to hear what's being said to it. Now, so far I've spoken as though abuse occurs between two individuals in isolation, and that's often true, but it's risky to focus too much on individuals. It allows the church to treat abusers as sort of bad apples, when in fact any institution like the church has allowed itself to become a culture in which abuse can happen. When an abuser is identified with an organisation or a culture, like a school or a sports coach or a priest, that identity of that organisation is marked on the individual who is the victim. And that's why you hear victims of abuse saying, I'm a victim of Ampleforth, or I'm a victim of the Roman Catholic Church, or I'm a victim of Ewan Camps, because the culture of that institution has been stamped on the individual and overwritten their own individuality. Lots of victims feel trapped into a cycle of calling for the church to be what it has promised to be. And the victim on the Jericho Road watches in horror and disbelief as the figures of the priest and the Levite become smaller and smaller in the distance, willing them to turn back and realise their mistake, unable to comprehend that the institution that shaped their personhood no longer chooses to recognise it. She might run after them, to reason with them, if her legs had not already been broken in the attack. Only when the priest and the Levite have finally disappeared over the horizon is the victim confronted with the realisation that she's truly alone. And then along comes the Samaritan. Being a bishop is a terrible job, or so they'd have us believe. I mean, to be fair, it has a lot of perks. But today's church leaders find themselves hurrying down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, under-resourced with busy agendas to fulfill, falling budgets, falling attendance. And as they journey, they encounter victims of church abuse, both current and non-recent, lying naked at the side of the road in obvious distress. I see this every day of my life. Neither the church as an institution nor individual church leaders can avoid deciding how they're going to respond. The parable could hardly be clearer. Church leaders have a responsibility to stop and attend to victims, even if that creates an inconvenient or embarrassing interruption in their business. They should stop. I don't know what it takes for the church to stop and say, this must change. But then what does that mean? What's the role of the church with victims of abuse, whether it's recent or non-recent? I want to suggest that their role is to reverse the dynamics of the trauma of the abuse and to redress the naked victim, to restore the personhood and the dignity and the hope that they've lost. We've established that abuse in a church context corrupts the relationship between the victim and the abuser and the institution. And that being so, the goal of the church after abuse must include the repair of its own relationship with the survivor. I don't understand why the church is forever talking about and investing in evangelism, reaching out to new people to invite them in, when there are hundreds of broken people around the edges of the church dying to be invited back. It's as if the church is only really interested in fresh young souls, not old damaged ones like mine. The priest and the Levite also need to be redressed, not because their roles of office have been stolen from them in the attack, but because by ignoring the victim, they've been stripped of their meaning. Next time you see a bishop who has failed to deal with abuse, but is yet dressed in glorious robes, bear in mind that those robes have no meaning until the victim has been redressed themselves. Counselling and compensation, all those things might be important, but this kind of redressing can't be achieved only by secular and civil actions. The real goal is for the victim and the church to be able to enfold one another, just as both are enfolded by God. It's the kind of reconciliation that Miroslav Volf characterises as embrace. Now, the immediate difficulty here is that the priest and the Levite haven't arrived on the scene equipped for what they're being asked to do. The priest who meets a victim of abuse might like to see him or herself as a bringer of healing, but first they need to recognise that they belong to the same community as the abuser. Any suggestion that the church can offer a sort of paternal embrace to the victim just reinforces the sort of self-idolatry that enabled the original abuse in the first place. Reconciliation is a gift of God, and it can only be received if members and leaders of the church are able to recognise their own nakedness, to enter into their own wounds, and through them into the pain of the community and of the victim. The task for the church is not to organise its business so as to seal up or scar over its own wounds, but to sit with them in the presence of Christ until they're transformed by grace. This sitting with the wounds is the first step to repentance, without which no other steps are possible. It's only out of spiritual brokenness that the church can begin to meet and embrace a broken victim. In fact, it's only alongside one another that the abuser and the abusive institution can find healing. Victims of abuse are the premier theologians of a broken church. It's my huge privilege to know some of the church's finest theologians, even if the church hasn't recognised them yet. Victims of abuse are holding up a mirror to the church saying, look, you too are wounded. And the aim of healing, of redress, is not to make amends, but to restore identity and hope for them both. A precondition for the church in enabling healing after abuse is to acknowledge that it's powerless to achieve it. If the church allows itself for a moment to imagine that it can undo the damage that has been done or heal wounded souls, it will immediately fall into a sort of auto-idolatry. The arrogant belief that the church has the power to heal its own victims is in fact an obstacle to that healing. So what's to be done? The first step in healing this crisis in abuse is for the church to devote very extended time to self-examination and repentance. It's a painful process, but utterly necessary. not a rush towards learning lessons and moving on. Until the church is able to cry out to God for mercy to staunch its own wounds, it will be continually frustrated. Only when the church enters deeply into its own woundedness will it find Christ waiting there to receive it. The second step towards mending is for leaders of the church to draw very close to victims and devote extended time to listening to them. You might assume that victims don't want to meet with church leaders, but the opposite is usually the case. The priest and the Levite will certainly have some explaining to do when they arrive back at the scene. But in practice, it's church leaders who, like the priest and the Levite, seem to find it distasteful to come close to open wounds. And the motivation for listening to victims as they show their wounds is not that by doing that the church can offer some sort of healing. It's the very reverse. The church needs to attend scrupulously to the wounds of victims for a long time until it's convinced of its own helplessness. And although I'm speaking of the church in the abstract here, of course this kind of engagement can only come from individuals, giving consistent attention to individual victims. The wounded victim is the closest neighbour to the wounded church, and neither can find healing without the other. In fact, there's no surer route to the heart of Christ than through the wounds of victims. So the church needs to approach its engagement with victims, not asking how much it needs to do to repay its debts, but with the humility to understand that it can never do enough. Redressing victims is not a punishment or a deterrent for the church. Some church leaders kind of feel aggrieved that they're being asked to accept responsibility for things that were done maybe in a previous generation. But actually, it's a gift to the church. Now, just as I said earlier on, that abuse is not an event, but a process in a relationship. So it'll be obvious then that redress cannot be achieved in a single event by the writing of a cheque or the issuing of an apology. The damage that's suffered by a victim might have occurred on a particular day, though in many cases it takes place over an extended period. But the trauma suffered by the victim and the abuser is chronic, and redress only comes through gentle and consistent attention to the other. The church, as I have dealt with it, hasn't come close to understanding that yet. Other things maybe. Words of apology, but of course they're worthless without tangible acts of repentance. The leaders of the church, who deal in symbols as part of their calling, will want to find potent symbols to truly represent their repentance for the church's sins. Think of Zacchaeus, another familiar story. The symbol of his repentance was that he gave half of all he possessed to the poor. That was a public symbol. It had no immediate benefit to his victims, but it was a clear public sign of his own repentance. What might a tangible act of contrition look like in today's church? Would the church dare to give half of all that it possesses to the poor in repentance for its abuses? That would be a symbol of incredible potency in a society that's framed by acquisition and wealth. But in all of that, the quantum of compensation doesn't express the value of the abuse. That's why Zacchaeus didn't just return what he'd stolen from his victims, but 4 times what he'd stolen. If you've had to deal with the church's insurers, you would know that that's not an approach that they favour. But to give back 4 times as much as you've stolen is to make a clear statement about the dignity and the worth of the victim. The key question for the church then in the face of abuse is, what will it take to restore this individual to a safe and healthy place where they can flourish in the years left to them? How can the church redress the victim in clothes of honour? It'll be different for every survivor. For some, their overwhelming need is for security. If the trauma of abuse has left you feeling insecure about everything, the restorative process needs to address whatever it is that will make you feel secure. Victims who are left with overwhelming shame might need some sort of public validation. Victims who felt excluded from the community of faith might need some explicit signs of inclusion, like a recognition of the value of the gifts that they bring. Victims who feel that they've lost their vocation because of their abuse might need help to rediscover and realise it. All of this is complex and deeply pastoral, a million miles away from the approach that simply looks to sign a cheque and send the victim away. Time and again in the Gospels we see Jesus not only healing people's physical wounds and disabilities, but more importantly redressing them and restoring them to society in ways that allow them to flourish. The crisis of abuse that we're in might well be terminal for the church. Alternatively, the church might resolve to turn around and make the painful journey back up the Jericho road to meet the victim there and begin to redress her. If it does that, it may begin to rediscover the love of God in shared brokenness, the brokenness that a victim of abuse shares with every church leader, the brokenness that the community of the church embodies and shares with the wider community. And in that discovery, the church may just find that its own wounds begin to heal and its own nakedness might be redressed. Now that's all I want to say just now, but I want to repeat what I said at the beginning, which is that for some people this comes very close. And if that's you, I want to encourage you, well, I just want to encourage you first of all about what a fantastic and beautiful and amazing and wonderful human person you are, whatever messages you've received from elsewhere. But I also want to encourage you to find right now, as soon as you can, other people who will also give you that message consistently over a long period of time, because you're amazing, you're beautiful, it shouldn't have happened to you. God bless you. Thank you.